Mr. Favor was a man who had everything: money, businesses, and respect in the city. He was known for his hard work, intelligence, and ability to turn any small business into a gold mine. But despite his success, there was one thing he could not control: his love for alcohol. Every night, without fail, Mr. Favor would leave his office, head straight to a bar, and drink until he could barely walk. His driver, James, was used to this routine. He would patiently wait outside the bar, sometimes for hours, until his boss stumbled out, reeking of alcohol. James would then take him home, carrying him inside if necessary. At home, Mr. Favor's wife, Ruth, waited anxiously. She was a kind and gentle woman, blessed with patience beyond imagination. She had married Mr. Favor when he was just a struggling businessman, and she stood by him through every challenge until he became rich. But now, the man she had loved and supported was no longer the same. Every night when he came home drunk, trouble followed. He would misbehave, sometimes laughing like a madman, sometimes throwing things around, and other times accusing Ruth of things she never did. His temper was unpredictable. One night he would be playful, and the next he would shout at her for no reason. Ruth had learned to stay quiet to avoid making things worse. But his drinking problem was not the only issue. Mr. Favor was unfaithful. He believed that because he was wealthy, he had the right to enjoy life however he pleased. He was always surrounded by other women, spending nights away from home without any explanation. The worst part was that he didn't even try to hide it. He knew Ruth wouldn't leave. Where would she go with their children? His children, Jesse, 10, and Anita, 7, had started avoiding him. They no longer rushed to the door when he came home. Instead, they stayed in their rooms pretending to be asleep. Jesse, who used to admire his father, now hated the smell of alcohol. Anita, once a cheerful girl, would cry when she heard her father shouting. Ruth tried to shield them from the chaos, but it was impossible. Mr. Favor made the house feel like a prison. His presence brought tension, fear, and sadness. The home that should have been filled with love was now filled with silence and pain. One night, after waiting for hours, Ruth finally heard the sound of the car pulling into the driveway. She sighed, already preparing herself for what was to come. James, the driver, helped Mr. Favor out of the car. He was completely drunk, his expensive suit stained with alcohol. "Madam, he drank too much tonight," James said softly, looking at her with pity. "I know, James. Thank you. You can go now," Ruth replied. She helped her husband inside, struggling under his weight. He was mumbling something she couldn't understand. Just as she got him to the couch, he pushed her away. "Leave me alone. You're always looking at me like a judge," he slurred, his breath heavy with alcohol. Ruth ignored him and went to get a wet towel. She wiped his face, removing the sweat and dirt. It was a routine she had done 100 times. As she cleaned him, he suddenly grabbed her wrist. "Why do you always do this?" he asked, his eyes blinking slowly. "Because I love you," she whispered, though she wasn't sure he heard her. Mr. Favor laughed bitterly. "Love? What is love, Ruth? Is it sitting at home waiting for a man who will never change?" Ruth said nothing. She finished cleaning him up, helped him to bed, and then went to her own room, tears streaming down her face. She was exhausted, not just physically but emotionally. She was 6 months pregnant, carrying his child, and yet he acted as if she didn't matter. She thought about leaving many times. But where would she go? Who would take her in with 2 children and a baby on the way? And despite everything, a part of her still hoped that Mr. Favor would change. The next morning, as usual, Mr. Favor woke up with a headache. He didn't remember much from the night before, but he knew he had been drunk. He walked into the dining room where Ruth was preparing breakfast. The children sat quietly, eating their food, avoiding their father's eyes. "Good morning," Ruth greeted softly. Mr. Favor grunted in response and sat down. He looked at his children, who were still silent. "Jesse, Anita, why are you acting like I'm a stranger?" he asked. Jesse clenched his fork. "Because you are," he muttered under his breath. "What did you say?" Mr. Favor asked sharply. Jesse looked up, his small face filled with anger. "You don't act like a father. You come home drunk. You fight with Mom. You don't care about us." "Jesse," Ruth scolded, but the boy had already stood up from the table. "I hate the way you make Mom cry. I hate the way you make our home feel like a nightmare." Jesse shouted and ran to his room. A painful silence followed. Anita was holding back tears. Ruth swallowed hard and turned away, pretending to be busy with the food. Mr. Favor sat back, stunned. He hadn't realized how deeply his actions had affected his family. But instead of apologizing, he did what he always did, he pushed the guilt away. "I have work," he said, standing up and leaving the house without another word. That day, instead of going to the office, he went straight to the bar. He didn't want to think about Jesse's words. He didn't want to think about Ruth's sad eyes or Anita's silence. He wanted to drink. And so he did. Hours passed. The sun went down. He drank and drank, surrounded by strangers, laughing as if nothing was wrong. He convinced himself that his family would be fine. 3 days later, he still hadn't gone home. Ruth waited. She called, but he didn't answer. She worried, but deep down she knew he was fine. He was probably with another woman, enjoying himself while she sat at home, worrying and carrying his unborn child. By the third night, she couldn't take it anymore. When he finally walked through the door, drunk and careless, something inside her snapped. For the first time in years, she decided to fight back. And that decision would change everything. The clock struck midnight as Mr. Favor stumbled through the front door, reeking of alcohol. His shirt was untucked, his tie missing, and his eyes red from 3 days of drinking and partying. He had barely set foot inside when Ruth stormed toward him, her face pale with anger and exhaustion. "Where have you been, Favor?" she demanded, her voice shaking. 3 days. 3 days without a single call. "Do you even care what you put us through?" Mr. Favor groaned, rubbing his temples. "Not tonight, Ruth," he slurred. "I'm too tired for your lectures." "Tired?" Ruth laughed bitterly. "You think you're tired? Try being pregnant and alone with 2 kids, wondering if your husband is dead or just too busy drinking and sleeping around." Mr. Favor rolled his eyes and walked toward the couch, but Ruth grabbed his arm. Her grip was weak, but her frustration was strong. "You don't get to ignore me this time," she shouted. "I have carried this family on my back while you go out and waste your life. You don't even care that I'm pregnant with your child." "Let go of me, Ruth," he muttered, shaking her off. "No. I won't let go. Not until you tell me why you keep doing this to us," she screamed, tears running down her face. Something inside Mr. Favor snapped. He was drunk, angry, and irritated. He hated feeling guilty, and right now Ruth's words made him feel like the worst man alive. In a sudden burst of frustration, he shoved her away. It happened too fast. Ruth lost her balance. Her foot slipped on the tiled floor, and before she could catch herself, she crashed backward, straight into the hard wall. A sharp gasp escaped her lips as she hit the wall with her stomach. Her hands flew to her belly as a sharp pain tore through her. A strangled cry left her throat, and then her body crumpled to the floor. Silence. For the first time in a long time, Mr. Favor felt completely sober. His blood ran cold as he watched his wife clutching her stomach, her breath coming in short, painful gasps. "Ruth?" His voice was barely above a whisper. She didn't answer. Her eyes rolled back and her body went still. Panic exploded inside him. "Ruth," he shouted, dropping to his knees beside her. He shook her gently, but she didn't respond. His hands trembled as he saw something terrifying: blood. A dark red stain spread across her dress. "No, no, no," he mumbled, his heart hammering. "This isn't happening." For the first time in his life, Mr. Favor felt true fear. He scooped her into his arms and ran to the car, his mind racing. James, the driver, wasn't around. There was no time to wait for help. He threw the car keys into the ignition and sped off toward the hospital, his heart pounding with each passing second. As he drove, memories flooded his mind. Memories of Ruth smiling at him, of their wedding day, of the time she had cared for him even when he didn't deserve it. What if she doesn't make it? The thought sent shivers down his spine. He pressed harder on the gas. The hospital was bright, too bright. The smell of antiseptic filled the air as Mr. Favor rushed in, screaming for help. Doctors and nurses ran toward them, taking Ruth from his arms and placing her on a stretcher. "Sir, what happened?" a doctor asked urgently. "She fell. She hit her stomach. She's bleeding. She's pregnant. Please save her." Mr. Favor's voice broke. "Stay here," the doctor ordered before disappearing down the hall with the medical team. Mr. Favor stood frozen in the waiting area, his mind blank. His hands were covered in Ruth's blood. His body shook as reality crashed down on him. "This is my fault. I did this." The weight of what had just happened crushed him like a boulder. His knees buckled and he collapsed into a chair, burying his face in his hands. He had been a terrible husband. A terrible father. A selfish, reckless man. And now, he might lose everything. Minutes stretched into hours. Mr. Favor sat in the same spot, unable to move, unable to think. His heart raced every time a doctor walked by, but no one came to talk to him. Then finally, the doctor who had taken Ruth walked toward him. His expression was grim. Mr. Favor jumped to his feet. "Doctor, is she?" The doctor sighed. "Your wife is alive, but she lost a lot of blood. We managed to stabilize her, but—" Mr. Favor's stomach twisted. "But what?" The doctor hesitated, then looked him straight in the eye. "We couldn't save the baby." Everything around Mr. Favor blurred. The baby was gone. The child Ruth had carried for 6 months. The baby she had been so excited about. The baby he had ignored just like he had ignored the rest of his family. A sharp pain pierced his chest. He felt like he couldn't breathe. His legs felt weak, his hands cold. She lost the baby?" His voice cracked. The doctor nodded. "I'm sorry." Mr. Favor's throat tightened. He wanted to scream, to cry, to take back everything that had happened. But it was too late. Too late to undo what he had done. Too late to fix what was already broken. The doctor placed a hand on his shoulder. "She's still unconscious, but she'll wake up soon. You should prepare yourself." Mr. Favor nodded numbly. Prepare himself? How could he prepare for the moment when his wife woke up and realized that their child was gone? How could he face her after what he had done? He didn't have an answer. All he knew was that his world had just come crashing down. Mr. Favor sat in the hospital waiting room, his mind spiraling into a dark abyss. The weight of guilt crushed him, making it hard to breathe. He had spent the past few hours staring at the white hospital walls, replaying the moment Ruth fell, her scream, the blood, the look of pain on her face. The baby was gone. His child. Tears welled in his eyes, but he blinked them away. What right did he have to cry? He was the cause of this tragedy. He had pushed his wife, ignored his family, lived selfishly, and now the consequences had come crashing down. A nurse approached him cautiously. "Sir, your wife is awake." His heart stopped. He wasn't ready. He wasn't ready to see her pain, to hear her voice break when she realized their child was gone. But he had no choice. He stood, his legs weak, and followed the nurse down the sterile hallway. When he entered the hospital room, the sight before him shattered what little was left of his heart. Ruth lay on the hospital bed, her face pale and lifeless. She looked smaller than he had ever seen her, as if all the energy had been drained from her body. Her hands rested on her stomach, but there was nothing there now. She turned her head slowly, her tired eyes meeting his. For a moment neither of them spoke. Then in a voice so weak it barely reached him she whispered, "Where's my baby?" Mr. Favor's chest tightened. The pain in her voice was unbearable. His hands trembled at his sides. He tried to speak, but the words got stuck in his throat. Ruth's breath hitched. Her fingers dug into the bedsheet. "Favor, where is my baby?" Tears burned his eyes. He forced himself to step closer, to kneel beside her bed. "Ruth, I'm so sorry." Her lips quivered. "No. I'm sorry," he choked out, gripping her hand. "The doctors, they couldn't save." "No." Ruth screamed, yanking her hand away from his. The raw agony in her voice tore through him like a blade. She clutched her stomach, her whole body trembling as silent sobs racked through her. Mr. Favor reached out to comfort her, but she flinched away. "Don't touch me," she whispered, her voice full of brokenness. "You did this. Killed my baby." The words hit him like a bullet to the chest. He felt the air leave his lungs. He wanted to deny it, to say it wasn't his fault, but it was. He had been drunk. He had been reckless. He had pushed her. And now their baby was gone. "Ruth," he whispered, his voice desperate, "please. Get out." His heart stopped. "Ruth, please. Get out," she screamed, her voice raw with pain. The door swung open as a nurse rushed in. "Sir, please step outside." Mr. Favor hesitated, looking at his wife. Her face was soaked in tears, her body shaking from grief. He wanted to hold her, to tell her how sorry he was, to promise he would fix everything. But he couldn't fix this. With a heavy heart, he stood and walked out of the room. For the next week, Mr. Favor barely left the hospital. He stayed in the waiting room, hoping Ruth would let him see her. But she refused. Every time he asked to enter, she turned him away. Jessie and Anita came to visit, their small faces filled with sadness. They had heard about the baby. When Jesse saw his father, his eyes filled with anger. "You did this," he muttered before walking past him to see his mother. Anita didn't say anything. She just clung to Jesse, tears falling down her cheeks. Mr. Favor felt his heart break again. He had lost his child. And now he was losing his family. One night, as he sat alone in the hospital parking lot, he pulled out his phone and dialed a number. James, his driver, answered. "Sir?" Mr. Favor's voice was hoarse. "Take me home." James hesitated. "Sir, are you sure?" Mr. Favor sighed. "There's nothing left for me here." Back at home, the house felt like a ghost town. He sat in the living room, staring at the empty space where Ruth usually sat. Everywhere he looked, he saw memories. Memories of his children playing, of his wife cooking, of a life he had taken for granted. He reached for the bottle of whiskey on the table. His hands shook as he poured himself a drink. But just as he raised the glass to his lips, he saw something that made him freeze. It was a small baby onesie neatly folded on the couch. Ruth had bought it a few weeks ago, excited about their baby. Tears blurred his vision. He set the glass down and buried his face in his hands. For the first time in his life, Mr. Favor cried. He cried for his baby. He cried for his wife. He cried for the family he had destroyed. And as the weight of his mistakes crushed him, one thought echoed in his mind. "I need to change." For the first time in years, Mr. Favor did not go to the bar. He did not drink. He did not chase after women. Instead, he sat alone in his house, consumed by guilt. The silence was deafening. The absence of his wife and children was unbearable. The once grand house, filled with luxury, felt empty, lifeless. Days passed, then weeks. Ruth was still in the hospital, recovering. Jesse and Anita stayed with their mother, refusing to come home. Mr. Favor had never felt more alone. One evening, as he sat on the couch, staring at the untouched bottle of whiskey in front of him, his phone rang. It was James. "Sir," James said carefully, "Madam Ruth has been discharged." Mr. Favor sat up. "She's coming home?" "No," James said. "She's going to her sister's house." "She doesn't want to see you." The words hit him like a slap. His heart clenched. He had expected it, but hearing it out loud made it real. "Where are the kids?" he asked quietly. "They're with her," James said. "Sir, you need to do something. Madam is broken. The children are hurting. If you don't fix this now, you might lose them forever." James was right. Mr. Favor had spent his whole life chasing wealth, thinking money was the key to happiness. But what was the point of all his riches if he had no family to share it with? He stood up. "Take me to them." James hesitated. "Sir, I don't think." "Take me to them, James," Mr. Favor said firmly. "I need to fix this." 30 minutes later, they arrived at Ruth's sister's house. Mr. Favor's heart pounded as he stood at the gate. He had faced powerful business rivals, survived betrayals, and made million-dollar deals without breaking a sweat. But now, standing before his wife's temporary home, he felt like a coward. He knocked. The door opened slightly and Jesse stood there. His small face was filled with anger. "What do you want?" Jesse asked coldly. I need to see your mother," Mr. Favor said, his voice shaking. Jesse glared at him. "You want to hurt her again?" The words stung. Mr. Favor shook his head. "No, son. I need to apologize." Jesse didn't move. Then after a long moment he turned and walked inside. A few minutes later Ruth's sister Linda came to the door. "She doesn't want to see you," Linda said firmly. Mr. Favor swallowed hard. "Please, Linda. Just 5 minutes. I need to talk to her." Linda hesitated, then sighed. "Wait here." When Ruth finally stepped outside, Mr. Favor's breath caught in his throat. She looked fragile, thinner than before, but her eyes were fierce. There was no love in them. Only pain. She crossed her arms. "What do you want, Favor?" He took a deep breath. "I want to say I'm sorry." Ruth scoffed. "Sorry? That's all you have to say?" "No," he said quickly. "I know sorry isn't enough. I know I've hurt you, hurt our children. I was selfish, blind, and because of me we lost our baby." Tears filled Ruth's eyes, but she quickly wiped them away. "You don't get to stand here and act like you regret it now. Where was this regret when you were drinking every night? When you were cheating? When you were treating us like we didn't matter?" Mr. Favor looked down. "I have no excuse," he said softly. "I failed you. I failed as a husband, as a father. Ruth, I swear to you I want to change. She let out a bitter laugh. Change? Just like that? Do you think a few words will erase everything? No, he admitted. I know words mean nothing. That's why I won't ask you to forgive me now. I just want a chance to prove it to you. I want to be the man you fell in love with again. Ruth stared at him, her face unreadable. Then she shook her head. I don't know if I can ever trust you again, Favor. The words crushed him, but he nodded. I understand. He took a deep breath, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small bottle of whiskey. Ruth frowned. What is that? The last drink I'll ever have, he said. Then right in front of her he opened the bottle and poured it onto the ground. Ruth's eyes widened. I'm done, he said. With alcohol. With everything that made me lose you. For the first time Ruth looked uncertain. Mr. Favor stepped back. Take your time. I'll wait. No matter how long it takes, I'll prove to you and the kids that I can be better. Then without another word he turned and walked away. The days that followed were the hardest of his life. He went to therapy for his drinking problem. He cut off every toxic person in his life. He spent more time at home, alone but sober. Every day he sent messages to Ruth, checking on her, asking about the kids. She didn't respond. But he didn't give up. One afternoon a knock came at his door. He opened it and found Jesse standing there. Mom said we can come visit, Jesse said, his voice flat. Behind him Anita stood nervously, holding a small bag. Mr. Favor felt his throat tighten. He stepped aside. Come in. The children entered cautiously, looking around as if the house felt unfamiliar. Mr. Favor swallowed hard. Would you like something to eat? I cooked. Jesse raised an eyebrow. You cooked? Anita giggled. Did the kitchen survive? Mr. Favor chuckled softly. Barely. For the first time in a long time his children smiled at him. It was small. But it was a start. And Mr. Favor was ready to do whatever it took to fix what he had broken. Mr. Favor sat at the dining table watching Jesse and Anita eat. It had been years since he had shared a meal with his children without tension in the air. Tonight they weren't afraid of him. They weren't hiding in their rooms. They were here. And they were laughing. Anita giggled as she poked at the overcooked rice he had made. Dad, you need cooking lessons. Jesse smirked. This is better than I expected. I thought we'd have to call the fire department. Mr. Favor chuckled, shaking his head. I'll get better. Jesse's smile faded slightly and he looked down at his plate. Are you really changing? He asked hesitantly. Mr. Favor's heart clenched. He understood why Jesse doubted him. He had promised change before, only to break those promises. But this time was different. This time he had something to fight for. I am, he said, his voice steady. And I know it'll take time for you and your mom to believe me. But I'll keep proving it. Jesse looked at him, searching his face for any sign of deception. Then after a long moment he gave a small nod. Okay. It wasn't full trust. Not yet. But it was a start. Over the next few weeks Mr. Favor worked tirelessly to rebuild his life. He attended therapy sessions regularly, facing the demons that had controlled him for years. His drinking had been a crutch, an escape from stress and responsibility. But now he had to face his reality without numbing himself. It was hard. The cravings were there. The temptation to go back to his old ways whispered in his mind every day. But each time he thought about picking up a bottle, he remembered Ruth's broken face in the hospital, Jesse's anger, Anita's tears. He couldn't let them down again. Instead of drinking, he poured himself into being present. He picked Jesse and Anita up from school. He helped them with homework even when Jesse rolled his eyes at his outdated math skills. He started cooking, not very well, but at least it was edible. Little by little his children warmed up to him. One evening as he was cleaning up the kitchen, Anita walked up to him shyly. Daddy. Mr. Favor turned, surprised. She hadn't called him Daddy in a long time. Yes, sweetheart. She hesitated, then suddenly hugged him. I missed you. Mr. Favor felt his throat tighten. He bent down and hugged her tightly. I missed you too, my princess. From the doorway, Jesse watched them, his face unreadable. Then without a word he walked into the living room and sat beside his father on the couch. For Mr. Favor that small act spoke louder than words. But there was still one person missing. Ruth. Though she let the children visit him, she still refused to see him. Every night he thought about her. He wondered if she could ever love him again. If she could ever look at him without seeing the man who had destroyed their family. One Saturday morning, Mr. Favor made a decision. He dressed in his best suit, got into his car and drove to Ruth's sister's house. His hands shook as he knocked on the door. When Ruth opened it, she looked surprised. Then her face hardened. "What are you doing here?" Mr. Favor swallowed. "I came to see you." Ruth sighed. "Favor, I told you. Just give me 5 minutes," he pleaded. "Please." She hesitated, then stepped outside and closed the door behind her. "What do you want?" Mr. Favor took a deep breath. "I know I've hurt you more than I can ever fix. I know I broke your trust, your heart. And I know that no matter how much I change, I can never undo what happened." Ruth's eyes glistened, but she said nothing. "I don't expect you to forgive me easily," he continued. "But I love you, Ruth. Always have. I was too blind, too selfish to show it. But I see it now. And if there's even the smallest chance that we can fix this, I'm willing to wait as long as it takes." Ruth looked away, biting her lip. For the first time he saw hesitation in her eyes. Not anger. Not hatred. Just hesitation. After a long silence she whispered, "I don't know if I can trust you again." Mr. Favor nodded. "Then let me earn it." She exhaled shakily, wrapping her arms around herself. "I need time. I'll give you all the time you need." Ruth looked at him, searching his face just like Jessie had done weeks ago. Finally she nodded slowly. "All right. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't love. But it was something." And for the first time in years Mr. Favor felt hope. The road to healing wasn't easy. It took months before Ruth agreed to have a real conversation with him. It took even longer before she allowed herself to smile in his presence. But little by little they rebuilt what was broken. Mr. Favor never touched alcohol again. He focused on being a good father, a better man. And one evening, as they sat together on a park bench, watching Jessie and Anita play, Ruth turned to him and said softly, "I think I'm ready to come home." Mr. Favor felt tears prick his eyes. He reached for her hand, and this time she didn't pull away. And just like that, after years of pain, loss, and regret, they found their way back to each other. Together.